It's that one or the other one? Jason, I'm pushing buttons up here. You're just going to have to make sure I'm doing it the right way. Cool. All right. Good morning, everybody. It's good to see everybody here. I have a certain affinity for my father-in-law because he reminds me of Steve Martin. I don't know if he reminds you of Steve Martin, but he's always reminded me of one of my favorite comedians, Steve Martin. And there's this bit that I can't get out of my head when I think about Steve Martin. I think about the absent-minded waiter. You ever see this bit? It's pretty old, where Steve Martin plays this waiter who he's really bad at his job. There's a bunch of people who are out there. They haven't even ordered their food yet. They haven't gotten their meal yet, and he walks over and brings them the dessert cart. And he's trying to get them to order dessert while they haven't even had their food yet. And they're trying to explain to him like what the problem is. And Steve Martin stands there, and as he's talking to them, all of a sudden he just stops. And he drifts off, and he's looking somewhere, he's thinking about something, and for an awkward amount of time, he stops and then he turns back, he says, "I'm sorry, I just went to the Bahamas." And this bit is so funny to me because have you ever been to the Bahamas when you were talking to somebody or listening to them? I mean, maybe you've been to the literal Bahamas. That's great for you. But have you ever been talking to somebody in the middle of a conversation and just drifted off into la-la land somewhere and you stopped listening to what they were saying? Listening is really the focus of this lesson this morning. But I want to think about, just really quickly here, in the wisdom of Scripture from Proverbs 18, verse 13, where the wise writer says, "If anyone gives an answer before he hears, it is his folly and shame." We know that. We understand that listening is important, right? You can go to James chapter 1 and verse 19. We can rattle off the verse. "Everyone be" what? "Quick to hear, slow to speak, and slow to wrath." We understand that being a good listener is important. It's a wise thing for us to open our ears, because if we jump to conclusions, if we decide about something before we've actually heard all of the facts, we can get ourselves into a serious situation. I think about somebody like Job, and really, this lesson is not going to be about listening alone. I want to talk about listening in a very targeted context, and that's about listening to our friends. Building friendships, building close relationships starts with a foundation of love, and it starts, I think, moves right into a foundation of listening. I think friendship is made stronger in listening, but that's where we get to somewhere like the story of Job, when in Job chapter 13, he says to his friends, as he's trying to talk to them, as he's trying to explain what is going on with him, he wanted somebody to hear him, but all of his friends just kept lobbing advice at him, lobbing judgments and criticisms to him. And finally, he just has to throw up his hands and say, "Oh, that you would keep silent. Listen to the pleadings of my lips," he says there in Job 13. "Oh, that you would keep silent." Have you ever had a friend who just couldn't stop talking? I have a term for this. It's the friendship filibuster. It's the friend of yours who just can't stop talking. They're always downloading their information into your ear holes, and they just won't stop doing that over and over and over. And it's like they can't even get a breath long enough for you to get a word in edgewise. That's kind of where Job is in his relationship with his friends. He wants somebody to hear what's going on with him, but his three friends are they just keep talking. And he says, "Oh, that you would just keep silent." Later on, he actually goes on to say in chapter 16 of Job, in verses 2 and 3, he says, "Miserable comforters are you all. Shall windy words have an end?" I mean, you could see his frustration. I mean, well, of course, with all the other things going on in Job's life. Job's friends would not listen to him. They jumped to conclusions. They thought they had all the answers. They thought they understood what was going on, and that is not a mark of a good friend. And so I want to talk about for just a little bit this morning is our need to listen up. Our need to open our ears, to be quick to hear in our friendships and be slow to speak. And I think this expresses, when we open our ears, when we listen to our friends, it expresses a care and concern for somebody to be able to hear them, to see them, to understand what's going on in their life. You know, I think about how Jesus sent out his disciples 2 by 2. You remember when Jesus sent out in the early part of his ministry where he sent out his disciples to go teach and preach in various places? In some accounts it talks about them being the 12 being sent out, but in other accounts it talks about 70 some odd disciples being sent out into all the world to go preach, to teach, and tell them that the Messiah was here. You know, he could have covered more ground if he sent them each individually. He could have covered 12 cities or 70 cities or however many people there were, as many places as there were people. That's how much ground he could have covered. But Jesus sent out his disciples 2 by 2. Meaning, they had companionship. They had a backup. They had this valuable resource at their disposal of their friend who was with them, of their partner who came along with them. That's exactly what we see, especially like in the life of Paul, the apostle, as he goes out on his missionary journeys. He takes Silas with him. He takes Barnabas with him. He's going constantly with a partner. Do you have a partner? Do you have a friend? Here's why this lesson is important to me, because this year, one of my intentions this year is to be a better friend. Because I've not always been the best friend that I could be. I've not always been the most open and receptive, loving, available kind of friend. Sometimes I feel like I'm so busy. Sometimes I feel like I'm so distracted. Sometimes I feel like I'm so self-absorbed and there's lots of things going on with me, and all I'm thinking about is me. And I'm not investing in these relationships with other people as much as I want to. I don't know if you've ever been there. You have a close friend. You know that friendships really take effort and they take investment and work. And as we think about the value of friendship, by the way, if you want to go back to the Proverbs and look for all the Proverbs about friendship, there's a ton of them. The wise writer has a lot of stuff to say about friendship. One of the best things we can do in a friendship is care enough to listen, and that leads us to the big idea of this lesson. Don't go to the Bahamas. Come back with me. Here we are in this lesson talking about the fact that listening is one of the purest expressions of love and connection. That's what we're going to talk about this morning for just a little while. Listening is one of the best things that you can do in a friendship, in a relationship. And I just want to stop for a second and think about Jesus. Jesus was an amazing listener. You understand that, right? He's the perfect teacher, right? We think about him often in the light of his teaching. But what was he doing in his teaching? He was asking questions. Jesus was asking questions, and then what was he doing? He was sitting back and listening to the answers. He was asking people what was going on with them, and he was sitting back and listening to the answers. You think about John chapter 4, right? John chapter 4, as Jesus is sitting there with that Samaritan woman at the well, and the dialogue that they have together, the conversation that they had together. No, they were not friends, but Jesus was friendly with this Samaritan woman. He was being kind to her, and he's asking her questions. She's answering the questions. She's asking him questions, and he's answering the questions. It's this conversation that goes back and forth between them. Do you know that friendship is like a conversation? Have you ever experienced that? Friendship is like a conversation, right? It's not all one-sided. the friendship filibuster really doesn't work in a friendship. It's not all one-sided where one person is giving and the other person is receiving, right? An effective friendship, a close bond, is like a conversation where there's give and there's take. There's push and there's pull. There's call and response. And these things that we see in a conversation, I think, really help us to see how we can connect with other people better. Jesus didn't just come right at the Samaritan woman and start barking orders at her. Jesus drew her out and talked to her and made her feel comfortable and opened himself up to her as she opened up herself to him. And it was just this beautiful scene. Jesus was great at this. And so what I want to do is I want to look not at John chapter 4, but I want to go ahead in John chapter 8, where we see another great example of Jesus listening, of Jesus being quiet, the power of quiet. You know, sometimes we think that speaking is powerful, right? And that seems pretty rich coming from the guy who's doing all the talking this morning, right? I mean, I totally get that. If we could switch this into like a Bible class setting where we could all just like call and response, talk to each other about what's going on, I would love that. That's my jam. But right now, as I am sort of projecting words at you, I want you to sort of think through these things along with me, as if this were a conversation. You know, think about Jesus in this story in John chapter 8 with this woman caught in adultery. We read the story earlier on in our worship. I do just need to say something, because anytime we go to John chapter 8, verses 1 to 11, we need to just acknowledge that this text was not originally found in John's manuscript. And there's a lot of contextual history around that, whether or not this text, this specific story, was put in later. There's a lot of questions. Whether or not John chapter 8, verses 1 to 11, really was John's writing or was someone else's writing who got folded in to the canon at some point. And that might sound like a lot of jargon, but I just want to throw that out there so that nobody thinks I'm just blowing by it. It's important, though, for us to see. Whether John wrote this or not, can't you see this being just perfectly exemplary of Jesus? Can't you see Jesus doing this in this story as all of the Pharisees bring out this woman trying to test him who had been caught in adultery, and they say to him, "Teacher, this woman has been caught in the act of adultery. Now in the law, Moses commanded us to stone such a woman. So what do you say?" And they put him to the test. And Jesus doesn't stand out there and say, "All right, I'm going to give you a 3-point sermon, and I'm going to write some stuff on the whiteboard for you all, and I'm going to give you all the details and all." He doesn't say a word. He doesn't say a word. He just ignores them. Like, he goes to the Bahamas, right? It seems like he's not listening to them. Oh, but he's listening to them. He's expertly listening to them because it says he's drawing on the ground. Like I don't know what he's writing. I mean, you can go to a lot of commentary. There's a lot of people trying to guess what was Jesus writing on the ground. I have no idea. I don't know what Jesus was writing. But they continue to talk to each other, and Jesus finally stands up, and in verse 7 he says, "Let him who is without sin among you be the first to throw a stone at her." And then what does he do? Goes back to writing. And just with one small phrase, not 1,000 words, just one small phrase, the master teacher lets them sit in silence. You know how powerful silence is? We don't get to experience silence that often, especially during a sermon where there's a preacher up here who's basically just downloading information into your ear holes the whole morning, right? But like, the power of silence is amazing. And Jesus uses the power of silence to allow them to hear what he said. I've got one thing I want you to hear. I'm going to say it to you, and I'm going to let you just sit with it. Jesus was helping them to digest what he had said. And finally, as we see here in this story, they begin dropping their stones and walking away. And eventually, at the end of all of this, it's Jesus and the woman, and they're left alone together. And he says, is there anyone left? I'm paraphrasing, obviously, but he says, is there anybody left? Anybody still here? No, Jesus. He says, neither do I condemn you. Go and sin no more. He doesn't give her a pass. He doesn't say that what she did was okay. He just says, stop doing what you're doing and just go along your way. I don't condemn you. And there's a lot we can draw out of this story, but I just want us to think about the power of silence, about the power of listening. Jesus encouraged his audience to be better listeners by being quiet and being silent. Can you imagine in the story of Job? Now, for a while, by the way, this was the case in Job's story, but can you imagine in the story of Job, if Job and all the stuff that he had gone through, if his friends would have just been quiet? That's kind of what he wanted, right? That's kind of what he wanted. He wanted them to hear him. And for a while there in the beginning of the story, that's exactly what was happening. They were being quiet and they were just sitting. There was nothing being said. And then they broke the silence and they couldn't get them to stop talking after that. But just to sit and be quiet is such a valuable tool in friendship. You don't have to have all the answers. You don't have to fix the situation. By the way, if you're married and you're the spouse in your relationship who's the fixer, who's the one who has to provide all the solutions, sometimes what your spouse wants is for you to zip it and just be quiet and listen to the situation rather than trying to fix it always. That's me. But, for all of us, I think if we can bring this skill into our friendships and just be receptive and be quiet, practice James 1:19, practice being quick to hear and slow to speak, then I think we'll be in a very good place. Now, I want to jump to another story here, because as Jesus obviously teaches us some really powerful lessons, I think we also see some powerful lessons in another story back in the Old Testament, in 1 Samuel, in chapter 1. It's a familiar story, but this really demonstrates the problem of jumping to conclusions, right? Because that is, in a friendship, really dangerous. It is really dangerous for us to jump to conclusions thinking we know what's going on and not exactly practicing 1 Corinthians 13, where it talks about love believing all things and love hoping all things. Love, the act of love, is going to help us from jumping to conclusions. But here in this story, we see how Hannah was vexed. She was vexed by her relationship with her sister bride, or I don't know what you would want to call Peninnah, but Peninnah was Elkanah's other wife who just was having children all over the place, just couldn't stop having kids, and Hannah's over there barren. She gets a double portion from Elkanah, her husband, but that's not enough, right? And even Elkanah's not a very good listener, by the way. He's not very receptive. He's not very perceptive. When he sees his wife's sadness, what does he say? You've got me. Aren't I enough? And Hannah's probably just like, no, you absolutely are not enough. I want a child. I want a son. He doesn't get it. Nobody else really gets it. And Hannah, after this story, is after this party, really, there's a party going on here, and her rival is provoking her and making her life really just terrible. So she goes out, and she sits beside the temple, and she's just crying her eyes out. She's praying to God. She's mouthing words to God quietly to herself, praying that God would bless her with a son. That if God did bless her with a son, that she would dedicate that son to the Lord. We know eventually that God did bless her with a son, Samuel, and she named him Samuel because of the fact that he had given her to him in this way. But she's over there just crying her eyes out. And off from a distance, Eli sees Hannah. He sees her talking to herself. And what does he jump to the conclusion that's going on? You are drunk, lady. You're over there talking to yourself. You're mumbling things. Who knows what's happening? I'm sure Eli has seen plenty of drunk people after feasts like this. And in his mind, just the obvious conclusion, you must be tipsy right now. And as soon as she opens up her mouth and begins to explain to Eli what is going on, Eli does a course correction that I love. It is so clear that Eli has jumped to the wrong conclusion, and then when he finally sees, no, this woman isn't inebriated, this might be actually one of the holiest women I have ever met in my life. And what does Eli do? He blesses her. He blesses her. Eli blesses her and gives her this great blessing, saying, "Go in peace," in verse 17 of 1 Samuel 1, "Go in peace, and the God of Israel grant your petition that you have made to him." And then Hannah replies back to him and says, "Let your servant find favor in your eyes." And the woman went on her way and ate, and her face was no longer sad. Hannah left that moment excited for the possibility after Eli blessed her, and she said, "Thank you so much." What a great course correction that Eli has. Have you ever jumped to the conclusion that your friend meant something different from what they intended? I just want to get down to brass tacks here for me. Have you ever been on the receiving end of that? Where you're in this conversation, you're talking to your friend, you're having this discussion, and they don't understand you. They don't get it. They don't see the situation. They don't process what you're going through. They only see a little bit of information, and they've taken off and ran with it. Have you ever been in a situation where you want to write a 10,000-word email to somebody just so you can explain all the things that they don't know and the conclusions that they must have jumped to? Have you ever been in that situation? And then conversely, have you ever had a friend who jumped to the wrong conclusion, and when you shared with them what was really going on, and they went right along and they shifted with you and they said, "Okay, well then let's get after it," right? Or they mended the relationship or whatever it was. We need to be the kinds of friends who seek the truth in our relationships, who listen for what is actually going on. I don't know if anyone's ever worked corporate jobs. I've worked corporate jobs for a really long time. And one of the things that I've noticed in a lot of the meetings that we have, this is totally not about spiritual things, but maybe you can connect with this. Have you ever been in a meeting where there's 20, 30 stakeholders in the room, and they're all having this conversation and they're trying to grapple with what's going on? What is this problem that we're facing? And somebody brings up a problem, and they say, "Well, this must be the problem, right?" And they explain it, and everyone's like, "Oh, well, yes, that's the problem." And they start lobbing solutions at it, right? As if that were really the problem. We spent 10 seconds deciding what the problem was, and another 2 hours in the meeting trying to figure out how to solve it. Could we have spent more than 10 seconds trying to figure out what the problem was, though? Could we have focused ourselves on actually saying, no, hold on. Could I be wrong? Could I have jumped to the wrong conclusion about what the problem was? Am I solving the right problem? And when we're in our relationships with our friends, we need to be very clear and careful to listen to what's going on in people's lives so that we can help in the way that's most helpful. So we can live with them in the way that they need us to be there. Right? It was great that Job had 3 friends who were sitting with him, but you know what? They were not helpful. Just being there is not always enough. We need to be there, and we need to be listening and not jumping to conclusions about things and situations. And so maybe as we sort of wrap up this lesson, I've got a couple things for us to think about. maybe this is a conversation you can have with your friend, actually. Maybe this is a discussion you and a friend can have together. Maybe ask a friend of yours, how has poor listening impacted your friendships? And how does it change when someone listens well? Just think about it in your own life. Ask somebody who you're close with this question. How is it that poor listening has impacted your friendships? How many people love to be friends with people who don't listen to you? I don't. I love it when my friends want to know what's going on with me. I want to be able to share with them what's going on with me, and then I want to reciprocate that and be a better listener for them. But you know what happens in a marriage when spouses won't listen to each other? It goes nowhere good. What happens in a friendship when friends don't listen to each other? When they judge before they hear the whole matter, like we read in Proverbs. Nowhere good does that relationship go. And so how has poor listening impacted your friendship, and how does it change when someone listens well? I think we can all see on one hand just what a beautiful partnership we could have with somebody when it's this dialogue and conversation mutually between us, how you're helping them, they're helping you. You almost don't even need to say a word because they know what's going on with you. Can I just say something else here about icebergs? You know that everybody's like an iceberg, right? You're like an iceberg to other people. You are this big, complicated mass of ice in the water. And what people see about you and your life sometimes is only just the little tip. And there's a lot going on under the surface that many people will never know. But that's what partnership and closeness with a small inner group of people is like, when you can open up and let them know about those things that are going on under the surface. Confessing our trespasses to each other. Getting real, getting raw, getting vulnerable with our friends is important in developing that bond and that closeness. Now you can start to see why friendship is not super easy, right? Friendship takes a lot of effort and a lot of work and a lot of listening. And so maybe the challenge for us, if we want to take on a challenge this week, maybe we can focus our conversations on asking good questions and listening to the answers. Here's part of the problem from a lesson like this. And this is, we could easily do this, right? It's like, okay, I want now people to listen to me. That's how we could leave this lesson, right? I want my friends to listen to me. No. You start by listening yourself. You start by asking the right questions yourself. This is what happens in marriage all the time. I go back to marriage, and there's a really close parallel between marriage and a closeness of a friendship. You can see David's relationship with Jonathan just for some explanation about that. But I think about a marriage, right? When I want my wife to do something, it's not just about demanding that she does something or does this or goes there or whatever it is. I have to lead first, right? I have to be the one who gives myself first. It's not a one-way thing. And so for us, I think we can focus our conversations with our friends on asking good questions. I have this little phrase that I like to use from time to time to remind myself to do this. And the phrase is this: become the most curious person in the room. That's a really good way to be a friend. To try to be the most interested and curious person in the room. To try to get into the lives of other people. Ask good questions. Understand what's going on under the surface of the water in their iceberg. And I think as we're listening to the answers, as we're having these conversations, that closeness and that trust and that bond, the care and the love that's there is going to grow. It's not really been a super complicated lesson, I don't think, but it's really probably not going to rock anybody's world. But I think we know, and just given how important companionship and partnership is, I think we know how important friendship is. Are your friendships with others as close as they could be? Now, you don't have to be friends with every single person around you, right? But having a close inner circle of people who you can listen to and who can listen to you is a really good investment. Jesus wants us to be in partnership with each other. That's why he gave us the church. That's why he gave us these relationships, not just so that we can have, a couple dozen, maybe 100 people sitting in the same room with us once or twice a week. No. We're built up into a family, a household together. That's why we call each other brothers and sisters. We are family. We're following our Father together. And so as we bind together, as we have these deepening relationships with each other, let's invest in them. Let's do the best we can to be the best listeners around. And again, I know this is ripe for me, the guy who's basically been downloading all of this into your ear holes all morning, and I appreciate you listening. I appreciate that, if you did go to the Bahamas, that you came right back. Being a good listener is so important, but one of the best things we can think about in regards to friendship comes from John chapter 15. John chapter 15 explains how Jesus is the best friend we will ever have. Jesus is the friend who has laid down his life for the sheep. No better friend can we ever have than somebody who's done that. And if you've not given your life to the Lord yet this morning, if you've not committed yourself to him in that relationship, then he has not been able to die for your sins. And you can go into the waters of baptism this morning, you can rise up out of those waters, and you can be clean, washed white, and in a relationship with the one who will never leave your side, who is the best listener, who is the perfect teacher. And if you want to have that relationship this morning with him, to give your life to the Lord in baptism, or if you need the prayers of this group for help in some way, we'd love to help you out if we can. Please come while we stand and sing.